In August of 1736, John Guy, a black man and a mariner, was returning to England after a journey aboard the Newcastle. Between 4 and 5 o'clock in the afternoon, he had disembarked and was walking along Rosemary Lane near to the Tower of London, searching for lodgings. Sarah Jones and Mary Smith were happy to oblige. They took John to the lodging house of Edward Witcher, where the weary mariner ate salmon and drank punch and brandy. Later that night, he was assaulted, racially abused, and robbed. 1 year earlier, in 1735, one Nicholas Parlementer, travelling by coach, had arrived at the Angel and Crown Tavern in Temple Bar. The Angel and Crown Tavern in Temple Bar, less than 2 miles away from Rosemary Lane. Parlementer and his companion treated themselves to 2 bottles of wine with cakes, a dram of brandy, and 2 bowls of arrack punch over the course of the evening. We don't know much about Parlementer, other than the fact he was a wealthy Cornish gentleman, rather free with his money, and presumably in London on business. Clearly, John Guy and Nicholas Parlementer were 2 very different men. Their lives could not have been more different, and the London they knew was almost a completely different world. Yet despite this vast socio-economic gulf between these 2 men, they both drank a relatively new and infinitely curious new liquor, but it made its way into the bowls and bellies of many a Londoner by the mid-18th century: punch. Beyond the need for a catchy opening, I've started my paper today with these 2 anecdotes because they prompt fascinating questions about the relationship between drink, movement, and social space in the early modern city that I hope to engage with today. To achieve this in 20 minutes, I'll consider the following 3 questions. First, what was punch? Second, where was it consumed, both topographically and institutionally? And third, borrowing a phrase from James Brown, what does this tell us about the landscape of drink and the function of new intoxicants within an urban space such as London? I hope to conclude by demonstrating that punch was consumed by a broad section of individuals across the breadth of 18th century London. And whilst it persisted as a drink with strong maritime connections, London's many drinking houses were happy to accommodate this blend of liquor, sugar, and spice. By focusing on punch, I hope to further deconstruct the popular assumption that ordinary Londoners operated and drank within the opposing worlds of Beer Street and Gin Lane, as exemplified by William Hogarth's engravings of that name. The reality was far more complex than contemporaries' assumptions might apply. But first, what was punch? Attitudes towards punch are difficult to fully articulate, especially when compared to other products like gin, beer, or coffee. This challenge stems from the fact that punch is not a product in and of itself, but a literal cocktail of ingredients. Indeed, the word punch actually stems from panch, the Hindi word for 5, in reference to its 5 key ingredients: water, sugar, fruit, spices, and a form of liquor. In 18th century London, this liquor normally took the form of brandy, rum, or arrack, the latter being a type of rum distilled in South and Southeast Asia, especially in Dutch Batavia. Originally, punch was seen as a wholly curious, exotic, and largely unpleasant drink, which, according to one pamphlet from 1665, quote, the Indians quaff. In 1673, the cartographer John Ogilvy described punch as, quote, very hurtful to European bodies if drank excessively, for it occasions looseness, end quote. Its intoxicating effects were potent, yet deceptive. However, by the 18th century, attitudes to punch were warming. Imports of foreign spirits, all of which were ultimately used for punch, rose from 527,000 gallons in 1684 to 1,223,000 gallons in 1700. This would only increase over the course of a century. The satirist and publican Ned Ward was one of the earliest proponents of this quote-unquote infallible cordial, including a poem in praise of punch in his iconic London Spy. By the 1720s, punch was all the rage. The Swiss travel writer César de Saussure provides a succinct illustration of punch's character, remarking that, quote, punch is popular and always made according to tastes. In addition, quote, a stranger who has not tasted it before will find it so good and sweet that he will drink of it without a thought that it might inconvenience him, but he will not fail to find out its hidden strength. De Saussure raises two key points. Firstly, he highlights that punch's popularity stems from the fact it is made according to taste. Punch could be altered to be as alcoholic, sweet, or as fruity as one might wish. It could also be drunk hot or cold, subject to the season. This element of flexibility would have made it appealing to many tastes. And secondly, punch could still prove a dangerous commodity, thanks to its hidden strength. Punch continued to maintain an aura of exoticism over the course of the 18th century, featuring prominently in the travel writing of the period. William Smith, a surveyor for the Royal African Company, noted in 1745 that he drank various forms of punch on at least 5 occasions during his survey of Guinea. Notably, he remarks on an occasion when enslaved Guinean peoples made him, quote, an extraordinary good punch with fine honey, end quote, in the absence of any available sugar. Despite descriptions and images such as this one by the, such descriptions and images such as this one, which was made by the American artist John Greenwood, undoubtedly influenced ideas about the drink across the Atlantic, situating it as a novel, exciting, and distinctly foreign drink. However, attitudes to punch were still contested in the first half of the 18th century. Unlike wine and beer, spirits did not have the same rich cultural traditions spanning centuries. As a result, their value and role in society was unstable and subject to intense discussion. James Nichols has considered this idea to be integral to the role and reputation of spirits in 18th century London. They, quote, reverse the relationship so that culture reacts to new materials rather than only acting upon them, end quote. Although Nichols is referring to gin, punch could certainly be considered in a similar light. It was a new commodity and ultimately alien to the social context and culture it found itself in. As a result, individuals had to make their own assumptions about punch and decide for themselves what role, if any, it should play in society. However, punch did not materialize in a vacuum. Upon first landing on England's shores, it was readily associated with one particular social and occupational group, as the images I've shown have kind of suggested, mariners. Indeed, Karen Harvey has already acknowledged punch's status as a global commodity, which was embedded within the maritime world in 2 foundational essays concerning the ritual and material culture of punch drinking in the 18th century. But the ubiquitous relationship between mariners and punch requires further investigation. Even as punch became increasingly associated with a broadly defined urban middling sort, most infamously depicted in William Hogarth's A Midnight Modern Conversation, it remained the drink of choice for mariners of a lower social station. As late as 1749, in his panoramic survey of everyday life in London, Thomas Legge, the author of Low Life, or One Half of the World Knows Not How the Other Half Live, described how sailors lately come from abroad emerged to drink punch and ale in the public houses of Rotherhithe, Limehouse, Wapping, St. Catherine's, and all other places of the banks of the Thames below Bridge. Such a description is significant, not only because it reinforces the notion that punch drinking was a distinctly maritime pursuit, but also because it offers vital information on where punch was consumed in the city by mid-century. Even in the late 17th century, there was an acute geographical dimension to punch drinking. In his 14th installment of The London Spy, Ned Ward and his companion arrive in Wapping in East London. Ward recalls how, quote, we went into a public house to refresh ourselves with a sneaker of punch, which was most likely to prove the best liquor that end of the town could afford us. Although the punch here is very much the best by default, Ward's comments highlight and emphasize the connection between drink and place. Elsewhere, Ward also associates punch with maritime urban areas. In A Vade Mecum for Maltworms, which was effectively an early modern guidebook for the best public houses in London, Ward cites one Collison's Punch House in St. Catherine's as the premier drinking establishment of the area. Ward also identifies 8 other locations nestled in various side streets across the city of London and its eastern fringes that were known for selling punch, and I've mapped their rough locations onto the slide here. Clearly, this is only a very limited selection from Ned Ward's own experience of the city, but the fact that punch was able to ascribe a degree of quality to specific places could suggest that punch was quite widespread at this time, beyond these few establishments. However, with no quantifiable numbers on the amount of punch consumed, it's very hard for historians to get a sense of punch's popularity or lack thereof. To test this, I decided to comb the Old Bailey proceedings online for data about punch and punch drinking. Naturally, this data is entirely circumstantial and an indirect form of evidence, which has its own challenges. But I would argue, if used carefully, can tell us a lot about the nature of punch drinking, where it took place, and when it occurred in 18th century London. So the data I'm about to discuss for the remainder of this paper comes from a survey of some 315 instances where individuals either bought, stole, consumed, or referenced punch and its associated paraphernalia, for example, punch bowls and punch ladles, etc., in relation to criminal trials at the Old Bailey in London and some ordinaries' accounts. The data falls into three main categories, which you can see on the slide here. The big one is, of course, references to drinking, which make up 53% of the cases I've surveyed, many of which provide fascinating insights into the ritual of punch drinking and sometimes indicate the social status of the individuals consuming punch. Second is in reference to a stolen item, which often tends to be a silver punch ladle, prized for its obvious monetary value and relative movability. In 1767, for example, a victualler, John Sidaway, reported that a silver punch ladle with a whalebone handle had been stolen, alongside a host of other household goods. Third is in relation to a place name. For example, there are a smattering of public houses with punch in the name, such as the Sugarloaf and Punch Bowl in St. Catherine's, or the Red Lion and Punch Bowl in Old Brentford. Some preferred simplicity, such as the no-nonsense Punch Bowl in Charing Cross, which was owned by a soldier named Joseph Smith in 1756. There was also a small contingent of dedicated punch houses, which catered towards this growing taste for punch. And finally, there are some miscellaneous references, of course. The data surveyed stretches from 1688, where we had the first recorded instance of punch, up to about 1780. As you can see, there are very few recorded instances of punch in the proceedings until we reach the latter half of the 1720s. Then there's a massive surge prior to the Gin Act of 1736, before a relative leveling off of cases in the 1750s. In roughly 3/4 of these cases, we also get some indication of where the incident occurred. Naturally, this is once again very circumstantial and witnesses vary in their attention to detail. We often only get the road or the street name, but failing that, we normally get some acknowledgement of the ward or parish. Often this is not the same location as the scene of the crime. This aspect of my research is still a bit rough, and I'd be very grateful for advice over how to improve it and display it more clearly. But here is a snapshot of incidents between 1688 and 1740, between 1740 and 1760, and between 1760 and 1780. And here they are all together. I've tried to pinpoint the incidents onto historical locations as much as possible, but with many of these, I just don't have enough information to be quite exact. Nevertheless, there are some notable observations. Firstly, instances of punch being referenced to the east of the city actually increase over the course of a century. For example, there's a substantial number of occurrences in the Spitalfields and Whitechapel area, which generally speaking was poorer than most. Similarly, at the very end of our period, we start to see punch spread further west into richer parts of Mayfair and Westminster that are rapidly expanding in this time. And meanwhile, the number of instances in the city itself, the City of London itself, and eastern parts of Westminster, such as Covent Garden, Drury Lane, and the Strand, seems relatively consistent. There are obvious demographic developments to consider here, but it does appear that punch's social reach was expanding rather than contracting. However, perhaps more strength lies in the question of where punch was consumed on an institutional level. Here, my research has been inspired by Phil Withington's recent work on the relationship between coffee and coffee houses in early modern England, which argued coffee houses emerged and proliferated where the material availability of coffee as a product had yet to catch up. This would suggest that the relationship between drink and drinking establishment was less clear-cut than previously supposed. By extension, historians should further consider the quote-unquote mixed economies of drinking establishments, their social function, and their stock. I would argue this approach significantly benefits the study of spirits, and helps nuance the oftentimes sensational details provided by contemporaries and historians alike, especially around the issue of gin. Fortunately, Anastasia has already done some fantastic work getting into those details just before me. But as Peter Clarke has long suggested, spirits were likely to be sold in London alehouses, even if the establishments did not advertise as such. Indeed, if we look at the data, punch was consumed in a huge variety of institutions. Although the vast majority are only categorized rather broadly as a type of public house, punch was referenced as being consumed in alehouses, brandy shops, coffee houses, inns, and taverns, as well as domestic spaces. It was also recorded as being consumed in shops, warehouses, and perhaps unsurprisingly considering its origins, onboard ships docked in the River Thames. Through an emphasis on movement, place, and space, we begin to see a world where ordinary people could experience punch on their own terms and in their own social spaces, either through licit or illicit means. One striking example of the latter that I'd like to end on comes from an account of one Thomas Beck. Beck, the son of a seafaring man, was only 18 when he was condemned to hang at the Tyburn in 1732. He recalled a time during his ordinary's accounts that were recorded as alongside the Old Bailey proceedings of a time when he attempted to rob a chandler's shop along Brick Lane in Spitalfields. Beck got away with a canister of coffee, a firkin of butter, and a bottle of brandy. He had intended to steal the cash desk, the money drawer, so to speak, in the shop, but he was unsuccessful. Which, once he got away with, he said he and his companion, quote, made punch and, excuse me, let me start that again. He and his companion, quote, made punch and drank to our benefactor's health, which we thought it our duty to do so, end quote. Clearly a fascinating little instance of somebody who we don't necessarily think of as a punch drinker enjoying its intoxicating effects. But to paraphrase Arjun Appadurai, these intoxicants are ultimately things in motion, and it is only through a study of their circulation within the spaces they inhabit and the context in which they are consumed can we fully articulate their social, economic, and cultural value. Crucially then, we can briefly conclude by noting that this landscape of drink was a dynamic and cosmopolitan environment, where new intoxicants such as punch could circulate freely, meeting the needs of a public thirsty for their inebriating charm. Although dedicated establishments for the sale of certain drinks did exist, terms such as coffee house, ale house, and even punch house often hide the fluid and overlapping reality of 18th century London's drinking establishments. Even supposedly plebeian establishments were connected to a global network of consumption. Punch's ability to percolate through this porous landscape was made possible by its distinctly ambivalent identity, allowing individuals as diverse as Thomas Beck, Nicholas Polemanter, and John Guy, who I began this talk with, to experience this distinctly early modern cocktail.